Well, hello and good evening to you all. My name is Jane Davidson, and on the programme it said that I have a great interest in long-term governance for future generations. But I sit before you tonight as the author of The Anti-Poverty Implications of Local Government Reorganisation, which was in 1995. And so I thought I knew a little bit about levels of inequality in the UK. I spent a number of years as an anti-poverty worker, and I was reading Joseph Rowntree Foundation statistics every week. And then I read the book that you've come to listen to Professor Danny Dorling to talk about tonight. 7 Children, Inequality and Britain's Next Generation. I don't think I've read a book that has made me more sad or more angry. And I'm so glad that you've all come tonight, because this is a really important story to be told, a story hiding in plain sight. Because Danny is a marvellous statistics, I always want to say manipulator, but that would give a wrong impression, wouldn't it? It would be using statistics, underpinning with evidence. He is telling the story about how Britain has got the fastest growing inequality in the world. That is the place we live in. So over to you, Professor Danny Dorling, a man who's worked in playgroups and ended up as Professor of Geography in Oxford. Thank you very much. Danny Dorling.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. My first proper job was working as a play worker, literally in the quarry in Headington. This is the quarry where the stone was taken to build the university. And I now just work 2 miles down the hill in the strange University of Oxford. The 7 Children book is sad. And it's sad because it is detailing what we know and what we've learned over years and years and years. Way back in the early 1990s, a lovely professor of sociology called Peter Townsend, not the rock star, Peter Townsend argued with government and eventually won that we would have statistics released every year to allow us to know in great detail how many children were poor, how many people were poor, and the material circumstances, what was actually lacking. And he believed that if we just did this and reported every March, governments would feel obliged to make it better on average than it had been. Now, you are probably used to reading stories about child poverty, and you may be shocked by them, but the problem is that you become almost immune because the story is the same. What is it, 3 million, 4 million, 1 child in 3? I could tell you some things, I may tell you some things that will shock you, but once you've heard it, and when it doesn't get better, you become used to it. And so we're now a country where we accept children growing up in destitution. We accept some children not growing as tall as their brothers and sisters who are born a bit earlier than them. Falling heights is now not seen as a shock. The majority of children with a brother and a sister going hungry several times a month, seriously hungry, not just a bit peckish, really hungry. Their mothers, sometimes their fathers, but almost always their mothers, going much hungrier than they are. We're used to it. I keep on looking at the numbers. It's a weird thing I have, and I get shocked by numbers. It's strange. What I've tried to do in the book is to turn the numbers into actual children, because I do realise most people don't look at a number and feel sad. The saddest thing in the book, there are only about a dozen graphs, is the United Nations' latest estimates of the change in child poverty in every country that the UN measures it to a high degree of accuracy. and it's just under 40 countries. And in a way, the graph is wonderfully good news. 2/3 of those countries, child poverty has fallen in the most recent 7-year period. In some, it has fallen by 30% or 20%, incredible falls. So you must not think that great progress is not possible in a short time, even in places you would not expect it to occur. But towards the top of that graph, you have a few countries that have had a rise of about 10%. They tend to be places like Iceland and Norway, which were doing very, very well, and a 10% rise is actually a small increase in children being poor. They're still some of the best countries in the world. And then at the very top of the international league table is the United Kingdom, a country already doing very, very badly within Europe, having a 20% rise, the largest recorded rise by the UN in 7 years, to a point, I think, 2/3 of the way through the pandemic. Right? The worst record. A country has to have the worst record on the World League table. The problem is the country that we live in, that I live in, that I go and give talks most weeks in schools to, where I have to tell children in schools, I'm sorry, you're growing up and your childhood is going to be spent in this situation when things were bad and they got worse. So this is an attempt to explain what it means when people banally say the most unequal country in Europe with falling standards of living, what that means for one of the groups which is most affected, because families with children have taken more of the harm, more of the economic loss than we have done in general. And so because it's families with children, this has been pushed particularly onto our children at the moment. And I'm not over-exaggerating it. It is true. It is the cold, hard statistics. The poorest fifth in this country are now slightly poorer on average than the poorest fifth of families in Eastern Europe as a whole. This is a peripheral set of countries, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. And it's been quite a rapid change from the early 1980s, when things were actually not that bad, through to the situation we are now, that many people have come to accept as normal. We're booking into the B&B where I'm staying tonight, and unloading luggage around about midday, and the host had left, I think it was Jeremy Fine, and there were people phoning in about the 2-child limit. And almost all the phone calls I heard on the radio in the kitchen today were about the feckless poor who must have fewer children and don't know how to behave. It was just today's radio, just bile, bigotry, ignorance, nastiness. I'll try and lift your spirits up a bit later. But, you know, I thought, oh, the poor person in W1A, they're not getting a single person phoning in to Jeremy Fine and actually saying, these are children. You know, you just had people going, in my day, or they shouldn't, or don't they know they shouldn't have more than 2. You're thinking, you're the same people who want to stop the boats and hate immigrants, but you don't want, you know, who do you want to have around? And you don't get that degree of nastiness without what we've allowed happen. How do you explain it? You try to describe the lives of 7 children spread evenly across the entire income distribution to explain what it is we've created. And I can go on and on about this. Last thing I'll tell you, I'm guessing most of you know about 7-Up. That's okay, and some of you may. I'm
exactly that age, actually.
You are that age, you really know.
I am that age.
Okay, so 7-Up, you're their age, and we followed them through. To find there's more. To find interesting children when they did, they couldn't pick 7 typical children or 12 typical children. They had to go to a couple of pre-prep schools and some really posh places in London and elsewhere to find one set of children, and then I think it was a children's home and somewhere else to find the others, because we were so equal in the 50s and the 1960s that if you just picked 7 or a dozen typical children to do 7 Up, it would have been boring, right? Because most young people's lives were the same. Even you come forward to my generation, which is not that young, almost all the children I played with at school had security of tenure. Mum and Dad either had a mortgage, and if they paid it, you could stay in the home, or they're renting from the council, and if you paid your rent, you could stay in the home. 1 in 3 children now in England, private renting, they can be evicted in 2 months, and many, many are. The idea that even your home isn't safe, and that's not because they're not paying the rent. The landlord can just put up the rent to a level where the parents can't afford to pay. When we got rid of we had rent controls and so on, and rent regulation, when we got rid of that in the 1980s, the plan was never to have families with children in private renting. It was students and young professionals. But we created a monstrous system where one small group of people, landlords, they make up 2 or 3% of the population, are funding what's going to be quite a nice retirement and life out of the fear and misery of families with children paying the highest possible costs for their housing. And we did all this. We engineered it. We allowed it to happen. In most of the rest of mainland Europe, this is simply not allowed and not tolerated.
I think that one of the things that would be quite useful to do at this point, Gianni, is talk about why you wrote the book the way you did. Because I read a lot of policy books, but this doesn't read like a policy book. It reads like stories of families who are trying really, really hard to do the best things for their children.
I did this book differently. A long time ago, I wrote a book called The 32 Stops about the Central Line in London, where I made up families at every stop based on social statistics about the wards the tube stations were in. And it was an interesting way to write a book, but it was only 3 pages per tube stop, and a train that was moving along from the far side of the Central Line. So I've written a lot of books which are factual books about the situation, and there's this problem that it washes over you. One of the worst problems to my mind about the situation we've engineered, where so many people are struggling so much, is the effect it has on parents. How hard it is for parents to get on with each other, love each other, parent their children, when they're worrying all the time about simply getting by. And so going through the questions that Peter Townsend in the 90s got included in the Department of Work and Pensions funded survey. Can you save £10 a month? Can you afford home contents insurance? Do you have a family holiday in a year? A family holiday is 7 days away from home, not staying with friends or family. And trying to go through and write a script about parents discussing this and these things to make you think about what it is like to get on and do the most important thing, which is providing a loving home for children. The first child doesn't live with dad, it's just with mum, which is one reason why the first child is the poorest. But you read through the circumstances of the children, and even when you get to the 7th child, you can see they have arguments. I may spoil it, but there were 14 million children in the UK at the time I was writing the book. I divide them into 7 groups of 2 million. I take the child in the middle. So I'm ignoring the poorest million and the richest million. Child number 7, whose family are better off than 13 million other children, and only worse off than 1 million. Child number 7, the posh kid, mum and dad run a corner shop. they make £25,000 each a year after tax and after paying the rent on the flat above the shop. So they've got a disposable family income of 50 grand a year. That puts them as the richest child. If you and probably your partner have more than £50,000 coming in a year, you're above that group. And we're at A, so it's fairly likely, because you've just bought a ticket, right, to come to a talk. And to be able to do that. The group of families above child number 7 take a third of all national income. We leave only 2/3 to the large majority. This is one of the reasons why our children are so poor. The argument that child number 7 had, and being statistical, 7 children, the 7th is 14%, child number 7 is in the middle, so 7% of children are above them. Their argument's about private education. Can they pay for Gemma to go to a private school so that she doesn't have to work in a corner shop? And the problem is that Gemma has a sister. And it's going through that real life things based on the statistics, because the families at the very bottom end of sending to private education are impoverishing themselves to do so, even though 93% go state. Going through parents talking about what they're going to do and what they worry about, I think or hope is more effective than giving you tables of numbers. Yeah. And most people reading the book will hopefully be parents and have some idea. If you're not a parent, I've been a parent too long to remember what it feels like not to be a parent, but it's human. And last thing I'll say, I start off in the first chapter with the mother remembering, okay, this is slightly artificial, but a book she was asked to read at school, which was round about £1 a week, which was a book published, I think, around 1913, about the respectable poor of London who lived on around about £1 a week. If you take £1 around about 1913 and inflate it by the Bank of England rate, you get £118 a week now. That's what the poorest child lives on. But the phrase from the book, Maud Pember-Reid's book, that stuck in my head when I read it, this is a book full of statistics about how people got by in the past, was which mother's nerves were worn to fiddle strings. It's that thing. Trying to get over the feeling of day after day, month after month, year after year of counting pennies and knowing if you do the best you do, things aren't going to get much better, but that's all you can do, and they might easily get worse. I'm trying to get over why it really matters, which is how this is wrecking so many people's lives, their relationships, the lives of their children, childhoods that you can never have again.
And these are loving parents, and they are loved children.
Yeah.
But I think you maybe because you have your own children, I want grandchildren now, being one of those 7-up generation. But I think I just remember some of the stories you told in the individual chapters. So the children, the first child is Anna, beginning with A. So we've got Anna, we've got Brandon, we've got Candice, we've got David, we've got Emma, we've got Freddie, and we've got Gemma. There are 7 children. And you don't really ascribe any ethnicity or anything to them, but you do, using the millions of statistics, ascribe a place in society for them, a kind of jobs in that income threshold. But it's those personal stories that make this so different. And I just remember the one in the chapter on Anna, which was about Anna using felt pens, and her mum could not afford to buy her new ones. And so she didn't know she was poor, but she just quietly put the ones that didn't work away because she didn't want to fret her mum.
Yeah.
And I thought that is, it is absolutely demonstrating that what this inequality is doing is destroying the parents because they get no relief from this pressure day in, day out, no matter how they are loved by their children. And the children who are growing up not able to participate in life.
Yeah.
Where did that story come from? Because you said all your stories are based on fact as well.
Well, my stories are often based on anecdote. Or somebody has told me a story. So I was told a story about felt tip pens and coloured pencils. Coloured pencils will actually last longer than felt tip pens, but they cost more because you can sharpen them. It came from decorating. There's a question in this survey that's asked every year about can you afford to decorate?
Yeah.
And there are amazing statistics about decorating. There are people in Kensington and Chelsea in the richer streets, because Kensington and Chelsea is very divided. Grenfell Tower still stands in Kensington and Chelsea. But there are people in the richer streets who change their kitchen every 2 years. And the cost is immense of doing this, many tens of thousands of pounds. For other people, redecorating means a tin of paint. That could still be £25 for a tin. For other people, it's putting up pictures drawn by their children on the wall. But then the question is, where do you get the paper from? Where do you get the pencils? And a lot of the illustrative stories in the book are stories that friends of mine have told me. That there's a story of a girl who didn't know how to get her free school meals. I mean, we have all the statistics about who qualifies, how many, how it used to be more, how we cut it down. But the anecdote, and it's a true story in Oxford. There's a school in Oxford where an outside catering company does the meals, and if you don't pick exactly the right choices, it will be above the threshold for free school meals, and you can't have it unless you pay, because it's not in the interest of the outside caterer for children. If you have a snack at break time and then try and buy anything at lunchtime, you go over. So trying to explain the importance of a meal, and those are things that have been told to me that I use to illustrate the numbers that we know about. So when you know that children are becoming malnourished, you need to explain why that might be, or give a circumstance that could explain what's happening.
Yeah, and I think the one that probably touched me most, and there will be people in this room who've experienced this, is if you live in an area, and I think you live in an area in Oxford, which has all aspects of wealth and poverty around it, and I've lived in such areas as well. And it means that if you have the whole class to come to your kid's birthday party, then unless you say no presents, you end up with the kids who can't bring presents because there's physically no money, or they can't bring a suitable present. And they might come when they're really young, and then they'll just stop coming. So what you're showing is not just the statistical analysis of Britain being most unequal, but the huge life costs that we're seeing and what that will do to those young people.
Yeah. So this, I'm obsessed by surveys, or surveys that we forget to look at. You know, very few people now look at this survey each March, and it includes can you afford to celebrate special occasions, birthdays and Christmas. You know, so we actually, and it's done very carefully. Well, except during the pandemic when it couldn't be. So the survey involves actually looking at people's bank statements, getting their permission, and just checking what they're saying. But the reality of saying that you can't or don't need to, it's not just a yes or no, there's a line, don't need to. And you can watch year on year. Increasing number of parents say that there's no need for a summer holiday anymore. About 1 in 3, rising to 40% of children have no holiday a year anymore. That means a week away from family and friends. The birthday party. You know, the reality of a birthday party, if you're relatively well off and quite confident and your home is big enough, you could open up your home and have a load of children come in. But you've got to feel confident enough about where you're inviting them into, then there's the whole issue of who's going to bring presents. If not, but you've got the money, you could hire a play space, a ballpark, whatever. But that's going to cost a lot of money. For a lot of people, very quietly, some cards, something from Granny, let's get it through, get it over with. And you have to remember that why is the book so dark? It's finished off after the worst cost of living crisis that we've recorded since 1798. In the 2 years I was finishing the book off, prices went up 30% above incomes. And the reality of that just means loads and loads of things stop. And families are getting into debt or borrowing the last bit of money they can off a relative, but that runs out. And so the book was written, and it hasn't got better since then, right? Things are not cheaper than they used to be. Inflation is still above zero. We haven't reverted back.
No.
But we've kind of sucked it up and got used to it and tolerate a government which says it can't afford to do anything about it.
But I think that's why I was kind of talking about it in the introduction as hiding in plain sight. I mean, the figures are all here. Yeah. You could get them. In fact, there'll be many other organisations that have used them, and they'll have used them to argue for changes. But this has been happening systematically, hasn't it? And it's been happening under all colours of government. Yeah. I mean, when did it really start? 2010, something like that? No. In terms of the worst elements?
The worst, I mean, it did start in the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher. The graph is just... So we were the second most equal country, large country in Europe to Sweden. We were Nordic in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. We really were. Not just as... When Dominic Sandbrook, so I've never met him, but when the likes of Dominic Sandbrook were lying in the 1970s, they have no idea how little inequality there was, how children went on holiday. It might be a caravan or camping, but it often was also for the middle class, because the middle class, the upper middle class on average, only had twice the incomes of working class people, not 4 or 5 times. Respectable working class jobs had never paid as much. There was lots wrong with the 70s. This was great for men, not for women. But for children in families, they had never been so equal than in the early 1970s. And then as the celebration of inequality begins, poverty absolutely escalates every year for the 80s, peaks around about 1997, and then inequality stays flat with some tiny wobbles, for 28 years. 28 years. New Labour moved 1 million children out of poverty so tinily across the line that it didn't alter the Gini statistic. Yeah. When that takes some clever doing, right? And you can say, oh, we took 1 million children out of poverty. But it wasn't effective at all. And part of the problem is, so we become the most unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. Still, we're all watching Bulgaria, waiting for Bulgaria to go. High inequality at one point is bad, but year after year and after year, it's like high blood pressure. It gets worse. The debts increase. The memory goes. People forget what was possible. They think that this is normal. And the suffering of this increases. The polarization rises. People try to get away from other people. Private school fees rise really, really high because people will desperately try to get their children away from the rest of this kind of society because they're afraid of it. All kinds of repercussions from just staying at this high level. And we don't notice it. So just think about the high blood pressure analogy. You get used to it, but your society gets worse and worse, and the risks of what can happen in your society gets worse and worse.
But all the changes to the benefit system have been particularly
regressive,
difficult and particularly regressive.
Nasty. George Osborne brought in the 2-child policy for reasons of eugenics.
Yeah.
Right? He didn't want poorer people having a third child. Not because we had too many people. It is impossible to give any rational motivation to what George Osborne and his colleagues were doing other than trying to deter the reproduction of poorer people. And you can look back at that government and the statements and what they think about themselves. They think they're special, they think they're gifted, they think their children will be gifted. They think they can have any number of children. You can go back to the 1930s and find similar kinds of behaviour, where the middle class was supposed to have 4 children each, but how can we stop the working class breeding too much, because otherwise we'll end up with a residuum. We got rid of that way of thinking after 1945 and held it back in the 60s and 70s and brought in child allowance and got rid of the idea that those people who ruled us were somehow specially gifted. The people who'd taken us to 2 world wars that we could have avoided. But now we're back to what I heard today. I hope I'm right, it's a Jeremy Fine show, but it was that, just to hear this bigotry after bigotry after bigotry about how people should not be having children in a country that hasn't had 2 children per couple since the late 1960s.
And I think the other thing that really came through is that we have the lowest tax and spend in Europe. And yet, if you go into any election and you look back over certainly my adult lifetime, it's all about tax in the UK. So we're being persuaded at every election that we pay tax that is too high when we have the lowest tax and the lowest spend, and our children are now having only 4% spent on their education when they used to, 20 years ago, have 6% spent on their education. So all of it, it's about how insecure housing, it's about insecure schooling, it's about insecure incomes. And you talk about the idea of falling.
And I expect most Labour MPs are not aware of this, which is ridiculous. So our taxes are the highest they've been for 70 years, right? Because we have an elderly population, the pension bill goes up, we do spend more on the health service than we did 70 years ago. And that's our line. It goes up with blips. If you want to know the blips, the blips are the banking crisis, where government steps in because it has to do something, suddenly we have the money, and COVID, where we step in the money. It goes like that. Every other European country, apart from being geeky, Ireland and Switzerland, because their GDP is dodgy, because of American companies and pharmaceuticals, every other European country has higher tax and higher spend. In Germany, an extra €1 billion a week on health. $1 billion. Forget that 350 million that Johnson put on the side of a bus. Right? If you're like Germany, it's $1 billion more. School spending higher, partly because people's children go to the same schools. They don't have private schools in most of Europe, hardly any, really. You've got to go to Chile to find the most similar country to us when it comes to education. And we're spending an enormous amount on this tiny group of children who are segregated from others and won't grow up as part of society. It's incredibly inefficient to do this. We've got more school buildings per head than you can possibly need. Now, imagine that 200 schools had to shut buildings because the roofs were unsafe. We've actually got enough buildings, parks, playgrounds. We just don't share it out. And this is the kind of mess that occurs when you accept widespread destitution, poverty, and the highest rates of inequality.
But we're seeing physical characteristics now as well, aren't we? I mean, you talk about boys the age of 5 in England and Wales being smaller, but still growing in Scotland. So there are things that are happening in different parts of the UK that are helpful.
There are, and it's complicated. So with 3 colleagues, we got an editorial in the British Medical Journal 2 weeks ago, because people were looking at the height statistics. This is my main job, is this nerdy thing. And they suddenly got taller. But what happened was, it was the pandemic. We should remember when the pandemic hit, children didn't go to school. If you don't go to school, you get a bit fatter because you're not walking, right? We also gave people £20 extra a week who were poor. But people also got a bit taller in the pandemic. So the most recent statistics are a sudden increase in height. That isn't a good thing, it's just being sedentary. But before the pandemic, we had children falling in height. In France, they're rising. In Germany, they were rising, a small dip, and then they rose again. The small dip was when my favourite European politician, Angela Merkel, well to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, when Angela Merkel cried and let 1.5 million Syrians into Germany, half of whom were children, the average height of a child in Germany dropped slightly. Our record is awful compared to that.
There's one last question before we open to the audience. You're scathing around the way government has acted in the whole of this time from all parties. What is the single most effective intervention that government could make?
Right.
And can we make a campaign about it?
You can. I am scathing, and I am. Margaret Thatcher, in I think around about 1986, signed up to the World Health Organization Target 1, which was to reduce inequalities in life expectancy and your chance of dying between areas and between social classes, so poor children will not be more likely to die than rich. I think Margaret Thatcher actually believed in 1986 that her policies would achieve this by the year 2000. So I can let her off a little bit, because she did think that trickle-down would work. I find it much harder to let George Osborne and co off. You know, I do think this is just dangerous. Jeremy Hunt was dangerous. But for the Labour Party to get into the situation they're currently in is almost unimaginable. The single thing is ridiculously easy. And you don't have to go to Finland to see it, or to Norway, or to wonderful Germany, or to the 15 most equitable European states. Right? You've only got to go to Scotland. Halfway through the pandemic, the Scottish National Party and government brought in a £10 payment for families with children under 6 who are in receipt of any benefit. They've now increased it to over £25 a week for any child up to 16 of any families in receipt of any form of benefit. In March this year, when the latest statistics came out, the only areas of the UK which had seen falls in child poverty were Scotland. Scotland now has a lower rate of child poverty than every region of England, including the southeast, which doesn't include London. When I was starting this work that I've done since I stopped working in play schemes, Scotland had the worst rates of child poverty.
Yeah.
Simply giving directly money, most often to the mothers, is the fastest way. It ensures that no child need go cold in winter or hungry. And we're doing it inside the UK. And the thing that gives me greatest hope, this policy is quietly agreed with Labour in Scotland. Labour and the SNP did not argue about child poverty policy. And there are many other things that they argue about in Scotland. This is only looking after the children, not the old. But it's happening in the UK now. The Westminster government could simply take the policy in Scotland and enact it. It is there on the table, and some of them must know this. And what worries me is whether there are Labour MPs going to their constituents on a Friday, listening to what's happening in some of the poorest parts of Europe now, which are represented by them as members of Parliament, not aware that it's on a plate, because we can't possibly do that because it's those terrible Scottish National Party people. And then it makes you more angry, because this isn't theoretical, isn't, oh, I'm Danny, I've got a great idea, why don't we do this? Right? It's actually been implemented, and March this year was the first time we saw the statistics getting dramatically better because of the implementation. Where it's happening inside the United Kingdom, and it could so easily be spread to England. It means a little more tax for university professors like me, hospital consultants, and bankers, right? Not much, just a little bit more, a tiny amount of spreading out so that children don't go hungry and don't go cold, how on earth do you argue, oh, we can't do it because growth matters, right? The growth of children, actual height of children. When you hear government say that growth matters, just say yes, of children right now who are never going to be aged 6, 7, 8, 9 again, right? And I cannot explain why they don't get it, why they are not more angry.
And it needs to be for all children.
Yeah.
And I think that it served Britain very well, and Britain was a leader in the world. And you point out in the book, in terms of your own experience, it's a great leveller, because everybody gets it. Yeah. And then those who earn more pay more tax. Yeah. And that's the way it's recouped. And that is a system that can help.
Oh, this is child benefit.
Most of the time.
I can remember. I used to resent my mum making us walk to the post office. But simply everybody going to get the child benefit on the same day, and you'd meet other people, and you knew it was yours of right. Yours of right for everybody. Not some. We won't give it to higher taxpayers, because then it becomes a thing. Oh, that's charity we do for the poor. You give it to everybody, and you tax the higher taxpayers, and I quite like the idea of having to go to the post office and get it, but it probably was unfair on my mum as well.
Right, your turn. So can we have the lights up and paddles at the ready? And please put your hands up if you want to ask a question. Okay, there was one in the middle, I think, at the back, and there's one there. So, right, let's go with number 2, because you're standing by number 2. And we'll do that one, and then we'll go to the middle at the back. Okay. We'll take 2 at a time.
Thank you, Danny. I'm a statistician for Jane Hutton. Housing really worries me in the UK. Scotland, successful in some things, they've introduced a lot of rent controls and restrictions on private landlords. They now have a housing crisis. Yeah. What do you think is the effective solution? I'm incidentally also a private landlord, so according to you, I'm utterly evil and should be killed immediately.
Yes.
Thank you. And one over here.
Is it me?
Have you got it? Yep.
Danny, earlier on you said something about...
Hold it
Can microphone, please.
Sorry?
That's better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Earlier on you said something about, in England we have this obsession with tax, which is different from the Nordic countries, etc. I read recently that the period of austerity, George Osborne, was very, very, very much influenced by the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, a tough and sweet, dark-funded entity, disgracefully in the seat of classed as a charity. Is there an argument for exploding this whole idea about the IEA, the fact that they appear, representatives appear endlessly with no demarcation on the BBC? Sorry, I'm taking
that's
fine.
That's great. Okay, those two. Private rented sector.
Oh, well, I think we corresponded about USS years ago. We did. That's the Britain's largest private pension scheme, which we're both members of. Which is part of our issues in Britain, that some of us have pensions which will be okay, others will rely on the state. So Scotland has begun to instigate, in effect, rent controls on landlords. You can see some of the things that don't work or work there in the context of Britain, but they've begun it. My views hardened about this over time. It is very easy. I could have easily ended up in a situation of being a landlord. It is relatively easy as an academic. You move between cities, you might meet somebody, you've got a flat, they've got a flat, you don't go into your flat. Before you know, you're a private landlord. Because it's so easy. But remember, you're only part of 2 or 3%. It's not a large group of people. Most private landlords are small-scale amateur. A few have many, many properties, but that doesn't mean they're nicer. They get many by knowing not to fix stuff, not to be nice to tenants. My objection to private renting is that we don't let people make a profit out of setting up private schools. They have to pretend to be charities or behave like that, most of them. Because if you imagine, I don't know, one of you would like to have lots of nice holidays, and the way you're going to do it is you're going to set up a school in Hay, you're going to charge a fortune, lie to people about it a bit because it's a business. So it's not called lying, that's just branding. And then take the money off people, and all you're going to do is give people an education that's not too good compared to the cash they give you so that you can have the holiday. We wouldn't necessarily let you do that. We do try to regulate a bit what private hospitals do so that people don't get rich on the back of them. But it's dangerous. And the same with being a private landlord. You know, actually being responsible for somebody else's home is really, really hard work. It's inefficient for you to be doing this. It would make, you might enjoy it, but statistically, having a body, I prefer the local authority state, but it can be a housing association, that is dealing with many of these, works better than you doing it. It always comes down to, in the end, will I take the single professional who's going to pay more money and be easy to deal with, or the family with kids who'll actually pay less? And so what we see happen in Britain when we look at the censuses is that more and more empty rooms are in our housing because the market doesn't efficiently distribute them. But we can look at Vienna or look at the Netherlands, or you can look across Europe for housing done better. Half the population of Germany are in private renting because private renting doesn't mean the same. You can't be evicted if you pay your rent. The landlord can't put the rent up because that's just a form of evicting you. The Institute of Economic Affairs and the Tufton Street boys, they're all men, almost all men. If you look at their websites of these various ones, there are women, but they're running HR or comms, right? They're kind of borderline weird. There's one paper recently called Britain Needs More Slums, advocating getting rid of all regulation on housing because slums are really good. And there's some young 20-something, it's either the IEA or the Taxpayers Alliance or whatever. Most of them are at the same address at 55 Tufton Street or King North Street or whatever it is. They're all within a tiny... And they're American influenced, American money. They don't declare where the money comes from. They're the vanguard for the big American foundations that help get Trump in. So their biggest operation in Europe is in London, around Westminster. We are the target, have been for years. Not Canada, not Mexico, not Greenland. What they want after they've won the USA is us and London. The next biggest group is in Warsaw, which is tiny, in Poland, where there is a mini Adam Smith Institute, which is another one of them. There are people who want to make the UK like the USA, who think it's good, and that used to be frightening. And now you look at the USA and go, well, that really, really should scare you. And the great thing about what's going on in the USA is it has scared people in Canada. It has scared them in Australia. I'm hopeful that we will see people beginning to realise, because they watch the USA, this is what you get if you vote for that big, supposedly strong man who says bigoted things. This is what happens next. But the UK has been on the target for a long, long time, and the cash has come from the USA that supports these think tanks. They got into power for 49 days. When Liz became Prime Minister, Liz Truss, she directly appointed from Tufton Street into the senior roles. And they were ousted by the markets and the Bank of England. But they feel bitter. They think they're robbed. They wanted more than 49 days because they really believe, a little bit like Margaret Thatcher, believed that her policies were going to reduce health inequalities and make Britain a wonderful place by the year 2000. They truly believe the stuff that they say. They're very, very dangerous, and they're very well funded.
And can we hold on to the hope, and let's get some more questions. Right, have you got, where's number one? Have you got a paddle? And number two, you've got a paddle there? Go, number two then.
Hi, Danny. My question is, children in schools in Wales and their access to preschool meals, how do you see
Need some
the
men
impact of
this time.
in Wales as a result, and how does that compare with the Scottish scheme of giving money each week?
Okay, and one here. And then
Hello.
we'll be looking for a couple of men. So,
Thank you. Assuming everyone here is also angry and has some disposable income, has some disposable time, but doesn't know where to direct that, what is your call to action? What can we do?
Yeah.
So far I've counted dosing the kids to private school and send a copy of your book to your neighbour MP. But I'm wondering what else we can actually take away from this and build on this, so we're not talking about this again in another 7 years.
no, thank you for that.
Okay.
I always like the idea that we sort of turn a moment into a movement, particularly when it's such an important one. Danny?
I don't think we yet know of the measures because it hasn't been long enough, except all the studies about making food free at school. And there are now quite a lot of countries around the world which are doing it. The first place, I think, was Finland, which did it during the Second World War and never stopped. So in Finland, it's just called school lunch. And in Helsinki, they gave food in the summer holidays and still just do it. It's no longer a poor country. Finland's richer than we are now. But of course you don't charge people for food at school. That would be inefficient and stupid. But it is not an either-or choice. It makes a lot of sense. So I live in a city where 10,000 people are getting free school meals. They're people like me. Each college Oxford College has a kitchen, an industrial kitchen, which cooks food at lunchtime for all the members of the college now, because otherwise it's a taxable perk. So the cleaners, the porters, everybody gets a free lunch. It's entirely possible to do it, and of course you wouldn't bring in outside caterers because you're just going to lose money. It makes sense. It's happening in Wales now, but it's simple. You just do it in Japan.
Primary schools.
In Japan, they get the children to serve as well, and other things, which are, is interesting of what you can do. What we do, stop being lethargic about it or thinking it can't change. The really optimistic and probable thing is, and this always happens, whenever you're at the bottom of a league table, it's probably going to get better anyway, a little bit. Peter Townsend, who I told you about earlier, wrote a report, I think in 1977, saying that government needs to intervene in the 10 poorest areas with the worst health to help. Margaret Thatcher got in 2 years later, they didn't intervene at all. 5 of those areas got slightly better anyway, because if you're at the bottom of the league table, now we're at our most unequal peak since 1936. It's already begun to turn slightly. Almost every pay deal since 2018 has been progressive. Communication Workers Union, 2018, 2017, it was 3% across the board. Inflation was 2%, everybody gets 3%. 3% means that the highest paid men, normally men, are going to get the most because their salary is already biggest. The most recent series of Communication Workers Union, but all the other ones I've seen, people pay the least are getting the biggest increase, people pay the most get almost nothing. Because of the cost of living crisis means if you don't increase wages at the bottom, people are going to go really hungry and you won't get anybody doing it. So the turn has kind of statistically begun. The last big time it began was 1918, 1919. Nobody noticed for the first 20 years because the beginning of a slight reduction in inequality and a cost of living crisis, and back then, Hungry 20s, general strike in 1926, mass unemployment in the 30s, all the time the pay gap from the top and the bottom was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Half of the equality we won by the 70s was won by 1939, but nobody was happy. It wasn't until the 1960s that people began to actually celebrate what they'd achieved. And were shocked because the rich didn't have any servants anymore. The most common job for a woman in England in the 1920s was to be a servant. 40 years later, there were no servants. It's holding on, realizing we've done it before, realising that the initial decade or 2 decades are always painful. You can't just grow your way out of this, right? Do work on those MPs. Politics is our only route to this. I do suspect a lot of them really do care, not least because at least 60 of them never expected to get in. Thanks to Reform standing and knocking the Tory vote down, people have become Labour MPs who were only paper candidates. So they weren't picked by Starmer's group as a kind of set of callous people. They actually do care enough to stand as an MP thinking they're not going to win. And those MPs really matter. That's why the top of the government has jumped and jumped and jumped since the local election results. Right? Enough of those MPs realise that they're not going to go from what, for many of them, is the best paid job they've had in their life, being a member of Parliament. And I'm being cynical here, but I remember New Labour. They're not going to jump into a job in the city that's going to pay them twice as much as an MP, because they don't know that information worth it, and there aren't enough jobs for them. Right? They need to win the seats again, and to win those Labour seats again, at least enough to keep a majority, they need to actually deliver something very, very quickly, at least a year before the election, so people can get used to the idea that something actually happened.
And we might just get 2 very quick questions in. Paddles, please. And a very quick answer.
Yeah.
Okay, number 1.
Hello. I want to ask a quick question about student loans. So I was very upset when I first deducted student loans from payslips. That really annoyed me. But recently I've had clients who are in receipt of child benefit, but also paying back their student loans. So it's affecting their ability to afford housing. Yeah. And taking, basically the baby is paying the student loan back. I just don't understand. I think it's absolutely, they didn't realise that students grow up and become parents.
Yeah.
Thank you. And last question.
Sorry, that's me. Just 2 quick points. So the first one is, as somebody who uses universal credit and has friends that are in abject poverty, I find that your word, Danny, is so incredibly important.
Yeah.
The second point I want to make is you talk about George Osborne and the way he demonised the poor. Do you find that Labour are also falling into this trap now?
Yeah. Okay, I'll
Thanks
just
very
that one first and quickly. Yeah, half of 18-year-olds go to university now. 2/3 of people now go to university by age 30. Kind of on the promise they're going to be paid more than average, which they cannot be.
No.
90% of them will have a loan. And if you want any, you should care more about children. But if you want a personal reason to care, I won't do a show of hands of who in this room owns their house outright and who's got a mortgage with only 5 years to pay. But that is probably a majority of people in this room. The people you think you're going to sell your house to, the middle class, they've got a student loan to repay, right? They're not going to be able to pay what you think your house is worth. So all we've done is delay it for elderly people. You're not going to sell your home because the people who are going to buy it don't have the money because of what we've done to them. That's what ultimately happens. There are characters who are more vicious within Labour than others. It's a broad church. I'm a party member still, remarkably. I'm kind of waiting to see if I'm polite enough, and I think they like Oxford University because they're a bit snobby. But I'm waiting. Liz Kendall says vicious things. I do wonder whether she's trying to curry favour. I would be careful because we record it. But it's odd to see that kind of the tough approach and this kind of belief. We're with the working class here. If we talk about fecklessness or about small boats or the other kind of side, there are some awful advisors to Labour at the moment. Right, be careful. When I saw the name of one person supposedly advising in the last 2 weeks, he was around 25 years ago, and I thought nobody listened to him then. I find he's in Starmer's inner circle, right? It's cock-up. It's not conspiracy. It's cock-up and not understanding, right? Keir may be the son of a toolmaker, but but you know he's a tool maker because it's what's written on his company director's form. That's a very exclusive school he went to. They have a weird set of people advising them. They think those ones who are being nasty about people who are poorer, and they think somehow this is going to help them get in again. Yeah. They're going to get reforming if they carry on behaving like this, and the people funding Tufton Street will have won. And I never answered your question properly. Anybody in the BBC or anywhere else in the media who puts them on like that should be ashamed of themselves. There's a book written in the 1930s in the USA called It Could Happen Here, about how fascism could rise in the 1930s, and we are close to that position now. And you have to publicly say, you should be ashamed of yourself if you're giving a voice to these people, because it has not been as dangerous as it is now since Oswald Mosley was marching in London.
And Danny, we're right at the end of this session, and thank you so much for giving your time, and thank you so much for articulating this. I've asked Danny just to read a short paragraph at the end of the introduction to this book, because I hope what it gives us is the idea that we can do something.
Okay. The future for Britain's children does not depend primarily on their own actions. It depends on you. What happens depends on whether you're willing to tolerate the high human cost of our increasingly unequal British nations. If you are not, but choose to stay silent, or if you instead believe it is time to speak out. Thank you.
And thank you. So, can I recommend the book? And I assume you're going to sign them now.
Yeah, I'll sign them now.
He'll be in the bookshop. So, grab your copy while you can.